Thanks. The next meetup we have will be in January. That will be the 14th, and it will be at the Feedback Fruit office, which is near Artis. Right, that's the office we're going at. Yeah. All right. And next up, we have some drinks afterwards, and then next up we have Noah.
Woo!
Woo!
Yay!
Yeah. Noah, sorry.
All right. Something has happened to the projector. We'll deal. Okay, hello everybody. How's everyone doing?
Sorry.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, the cursor thing.
Oh,
Here.
God. That would have driven me nuts. Thank you. Yes. So, hello. Yeah, my name is Noah. I do security things for a company. You can find me on Twitter at additional text. Great. I'm here to talk to you today about the Hippocratic license. Not the, yeah. So what we're going to do, I do have an agenda slide. Just mixing it up a little, keeping things fresh. Well, I guess not really mixing it up, but yeah. So we're talking about what is the Hippocratic license. We're talking about how did it happen, where did it come from, what do I need to consider if I'm implementing it or if I'm just thinking about it. Why is it important? And then there is hopefully going to be some discussion. It'll be good. I have questions prepared. Don't worry. Yes. I also have a threat, but we'll get to that later. Yeah. So the license was started by Corlina again. I think this is a useful quote. There's a lot of text on these. I'm not going to read all of them, just so we're square on that. So open source licenses have long been the primary tool for promoting the use of our software under our own rules and conditions. I think that bit is really important. Our own rules and conditions. In the past, these licenses were used to allow the free distribution, modification, and use of our software. But there is nothing stopping us from taking this further. Nothing at all, right? I mean, that's the point. We can do software under our own rules and conditions. So why not take it further? So she created what's called Hippocratic license. You find it in firstdonoharm.dev. It's basically a modified MIT license, so it'll look very familiar to you if you're familiar with that license. Just standard kind of open source stuff. It has one addition, which is that it prohibits the use of open source software, as you can see on the screen, to harm others based on the UN's definition. This is kind of the major addition. So like, if you're looking at a standard MIT license, there's some other stuff about what happens if the license is like invalid or something. But generally, the idea is that, does this have a laser thing? Yes. Excuse me, I can play with this for 5 minutes. Yeah, so the software may not be used by anyone for systems or activities that actively, knowingly endanger, harm, threaten the physical, mental, economic, or general well-being of other individuals or groups. So if you have this license and somebody tries to use it to do something that threatens these things, no good, right? TLDR can't be used by anyone in any way in the pursuit of knowingly causing harm. And we're going to get to why that's important. Trust me. How did it happen? So also TLDR is that basically there's been a lot of talk about how the open source initiative and other big kind of open source bodies talk about how you can use their software. And one of the things they say is that open source software must not discriminate and must not prevent itself from being used in any kind of way, right? So you can't say, oh, only, the idea being that you can't say, oh, only this kind of person or this kind of company or only people from this one city can use my software. Which, like, incidentally, we know is like not the case for lots of reasons, which we will get to. Lots of open source is used to do bad things that hurt people or make it easier to do these things, right? And so, partially, one, I think, could make the argument that that does go against that it must not, discriminate in terms of use, right? So it is making it so people can't use it. If you, drone bomb somebody, like, they can't use your software. But that's why I don't write open source licenses. Because Golang decides that we need an open source license that allows maintainers to take a stand and prevent their work from being used in this way. You can see the text and you can get the actual license there. It's going through some iterations. One question you may ask, is it being used? Yeah. So I helped convince, with Ulix's help, well-known file sharing app WeTransfer to adopt it for their open source projects. Yay! Thank you. I find a tactical nuclear PR submission does wonders. You can do this too. Like, you can just submit a PR to a thing and be like, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if we, like, you know, took a stand? That'd be kind of neat. It'd be kind of swell. I will say, the license isn't final. It's not in, like, version, you know, done, final, done, ship, done. There's no uptake lag. So it can change. There are some things to consider. If you want to include this license, it can have an impact in, you know, things upstream and downstream from you. People decide to stop using your stuff, and then they decide to stop using stuff that includes your stuff. I would say good riddance, but you know, that depends. License is new enough. Like, this is just like some like boring technical stuff, but like the license is new enough that it's not in your like package control system, so like it's not in the gem spec thingy. I don't believe yet. Enforceability has not been tested. To be honest, like for most of these kinds of things, enforceability has not been tested. There isn't enough uptake yet to have like, oh, this is the big case where we finally took, you know, this company used this to do harm someone's human rights, and so then we sued them. There's a whole thing. It's too new for that. One thing that I find very concerning is that this last one, which is that it's not really set up to prevent itself from being used for PR. So do as I say, not as I do. I find that there's a... does anyone here watch Silicon Valley? So they had that episode about ethics, right? Tech ethics. And, you know, it was what it was, right? But I think what they made very clear is that people who support these things often will do so they can get the PR bump, right? And it's about what kind of actions you can take to follow through. Does the company that selects these things then make sure that none of their customers are doing these kinds of things? Are they thinking about this, or is it just a nice way to say, hey, look at me? You know, that does worry me. There's nothing built in to make that not happen, right? You can just add this license and do what you want. Why is it important to have a license like this, right? I realize whatever. Anyone know who Howard Zinn is? Yes. Okay. So Howard Zinn was a very, very cool historian. He wrote a lot about how history doesn't tell the story. The history we're taught doesn't often tell the kind of stories that it ought to, right? So it focuses on the winners. It focuses on the people in power. It says, hey, you know, all this amazing stuff happened. Like, what about all the people who were, you know, trampled? He says, quote, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Tech is very much a moving train, right? I think we can't argue with that. You know, the automated car people are obsessed with the whole, you know, trolley problem, right? And you know, a lot of tech is that, right? Yeah, and you can't be neutral. I don't think that you can afford to be neutral. Being neutral is itself taking, like, I mean, it's such an obnoxious thing to say, but like, being neutral is itself taking a stance. It's saying, I don't care. And I don't think we can afford to not care, right? I think a really good example of this, you know, I think there's no substitute for action. Our you know, little pig GitHub. So the letter that got leaked that started a lot of the action around GitHub has this quote: as a matter of principle, we believe the appropriate way to advocate for our values in a democracy is to use our corporate voice and not to unplug technology services when government customers use them to do things to which we object. Like, horseshit, right? Like, What is the point of having a corporate voice? What does that mean? Nobody knows. What does it mean to have a corporate voice if you can't, like, how can you use a corporate voice if you don't do anything? Right? I can stand up here and talk all day, right? I mean, I can come up and say, like, I don't know, make something up, like, all right, I'm releasing, Ruby 2.8, right? But I don't have the power to do that. GitHub, however, does have the power, quite literally, to unplug technology services when government, customers use them to do things to which they object, right? And I think if they're not doing it, it's a bad thing. They're being neutral on a moving train. They're trying to say, well, look, we're really sad that the train is going to run over this village, or the train is going to indefinitely detain some children, but it's a complicated laugh, isn't it? Right? But we're just not going to do anything about it because we don't believe in that. Like, what does that mean? What do you believe? There's loads of examples like this. There was a slide recently of, like, sorry for the Kubernetes fans in the audience, but like talking about how the DoD, Department of Defense in America, loves Kubernetes, right? I had a job interview with a video game company, but it was an infrastructure company, and they were talking, And then someone offhand mentions, yeah, it's really good that we have security engineers because we keep doing all these contracts with the military. That's interesting. So you can look up, like, public contracts, right? And, they're making upwards of tens of millions of dollars from military contracts. That's like, well, no, thank you. That's not okay with me, right? I want to be upfront about these things. And there's no substitute for taking action. There just isn't. I think that the license that I'm here to talk about tonight is a way to instigate people to take action. Right? It's a way to say, look, I need to think about this repo that I'm making. I need to think about this software. Maybe you don't use it. Maybe you go away and you're like, man, that Noah guy, what a piece of shit. But it's important to consider these things and then to act. Okay, so action, right? What can we do? I really think there's 4 things. There's no magic. There's 4 things you can do. So have conversations. Doesn't have to be, hey, big boss, why are we doing this? It can be, at the lunch table, hey, do you see that we have this client in, like, somewhere that's doing something awful with our software? Like, what's up with that? Or it can just be like, hey, why are we on call 24/7, 365, right? Because this stuff has to be internal as well, right? This can't just be, the way we externally use software. It's to be, how do we internally develop the software, right? We all work together. Right? Ask questions. Just be like, hey, what's up? Why is this like this? I'm very irritating in that way. I'm often in Slack channels being like, why is this happening? People are like, oh, it's because, well, that's weird. Talk to your colleagues. Talk to colleagues who are not necessarily colleagues you think you would talk to. I would say talk to support as much as possible. I find that if I want to get a good gauge on how my work is going and how people are using my stuff, there is no better way to do that than talking to support, because they see it all, right? I mean, we're talking about, production. You just can't predict anything, and support will see all those things. Number 4 is probably the most important. Something doesn't seem right, like, talk about it, and then see what action you can take. Maybe it's not a big one, right? I'm not, I think everyone can take action in their own way. I'm not mandating a particular way of doing it. Maybe it's you add this license to one of your repos at work, whatever. You make your company legal department ask questions. And then you say, well, it's interesting that you're asking these questions because we did this thing. And then more questions get asked. It can be scary. That's why I think it's good to have groups like this, right? People, nice, cool, sitting in this. Yes, this is a basement. I like basements. I learned to code in the basement. Anyway. So I think we should move on to some discussion points. Before we do, because I think it's important to talk about this. Before we do, if any of this is interesting to you, might I suggest that you follow Tech Workers Amps on Twitter and look up Tech Workers Coalition. We're trying to kickstart a way of getting tech workers of every stripe together to discuss and take action in whatever we see. Just a little plug. Little plug. Stay with me.
You can make it a bigger plug.
I can make it a bigger plug.
Make it a bigger plug. There's two of us in the room. Come talk to us.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Come talk to me, Don. Yeah, ask me questions on Twitter. If you don't want to follow it or don't have to, you can always talk to me. Talk to Don. We're great. I don't know. We have buttons. We don't have any more buttons, but we do have stickers. Anyway, so I think there's some 4 things that would be useful to talk about. I do want to mention that I have a threat. If anybody says not a comment, just a question, we're going to put you in the canal. So that was funny to me. Nobody establishing a baseline. I guess that's not really part of the code of conduct. I wouldn't really put you in the canal. Yeah, so I think one thing is, how can we relate this sort of stuff specifically to the community? Is Matt is nice, so we are nice enough, right? Or do we need more? Mince one, right? How can we take action that goes beyond the license? What would happen if tech wasn't used to do harm? How would that change our lives? And what are the institutional forces that make this difficult, and how can we improve or even replace them? Even if you don't necessarily want to talk this now, you can always DM me on Twitter, whatever, on the Amsterdam movie platform. Does anybody have any?
I don't know. Oh, sorry.
No, no.
I don't really understand it.
Which bit?
The extension of the code of conduct and the extension, the Hippocratic extension.
Yeah.
Because I had to look up the human rights, and I don't understand how it relates to the human rights.
Yeah. So the idea is that if software is used to violate those human rights, any of the ones in there, it is in violation of the license.
Yeah, but that's a violation of the human rights.
Yes.
Not granting access to some software is a violation of the human rights itself.
No. Other way around. I disagree. So no. So
Both ways.
yes. So no. So nobody has a human right to access software, right? I think that's it. I mean, many people cannot. Right?
No.
So their rights are already being violated. Right? If there is a universal, I mean, I do agree with you. I think absolutely that internet access should be universal and free. It should be a utility. It should be high quality. It should be given to everyone without billing. They should.
No, but I think it's mainly about the right on your own opinion, or on having an opinion, and whose opinions of what harm is are we enforcing here?
I think that's absolutely fair. I think that the notion here is to give this a good baseline as a way to start at how do we decide what software can and can't be used for. Our software, not every piece of software, but I personally, I mean, there's lots of things I wouldn't let my own software be used for. Like, I can't enforce most of those things. I can at least say that if you use it to violate someone's human rights, you can't use it.
Can I jump in for
Please.
this moment? I think this is a sort of critique that comes up frequently in these sorts of cases, is that there's an appeal to moral relativism here. Like, what I think is unright or not right may differ from what other people in the room think is not right. And so how do we adjudicate and within the legal framework of the software license what constitutes unfair use of the license? And one of the reasons that Coraline moved to basing it on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that this is a fairly unambiguous document. It's a very baseline document. It's fairly egregious what you have to do to violate these rights, but it's very unequivocal, right? It's very clear. It's a bright line. right? And there are a lot of international law precedents that help us understand what constitutes a violation of human rights under this declaration and what doesn't. So there's a lot of judicial law that's already in place that helps us understand like what's a violation, what isn't a violation. And on top of that, it's although non-binding under law, it's been signed by all but 40-something countries, and certainly the United States, most of Europe, right? The countries that really are consuming open source software, most of these are signatories to this declaration, right? And so, although something like, I don't know, racist acts are not going to constitute a violation of human rights under this license, and so are not going to fall under the jurisdiction of this clause, something like denying medical care to prisoners, for example, is going to constitute, like clearly constitute a violation of human rights. Oh, and guess what? Software is being used to do that right now. And it would be really nice if we had systems in place because the people who built, for example, Ruby on Rails, DHH has been very critical of certain practices of ICE. GitHub's built on ICE. Like, wouldn't it be nice if the Hippocratic license was applied to Ruby on Rails? And then we could say that, for example, GitHub's leadership was in violation of the terms because they're using their software to violate human rights on behalf of ICE, right? That's the idea behind this mechanism. Anything on top of that, like there's not a lot of case law that would allow us to build a strong case for example, for violations of a code of conduct, right? Like that's not going to happen. But human rights seem like a fairly unequivocal place to build from anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think it also is that unambiguity. So there's been a lot of talk, really hard to talk, right, about how do you enforce the code of conduct? Who's responsible? Who's not responsible? How do you do it responsibly? This is unambiguous, right? This is like, if it really came down to it, like there are, as Dan says, legal bodies who could take up something like this, right? Because you could say, well, look, they violated this thing. It's in the, there's been X cases about it. You can make these people, you can find people who will be responsible for dealing with it, right? In a way that is not always possible.
So I think it's a very nice idea, but there's definitely problems that need to be sorted out. Because OSI, with all its flaws, of course, they made a very, very conscious choice not to exclude people from the license parameters. That's one that's definitely on debate here. That's the whole point. But more deeply, like people who violate human rights laws, they're not going to give a flying about software licenses.
Yep.
But maybe their providers would. That's sort of what you're aiming at, right?
I think also on the first one, I think that let me see if I can. So, it's part of the idea of open source is that we can use our software under our own control, right? And there's many things that people say about this, right? That is notionally the idea. That we as open source people, contributors and software people are in control of the software that's happening, right? And there's many reasons it's complicated.
I honestly disagree. Because I do think that open source software has been created to protect the user, not the software creator, like explicitly. That was the original point of GPL and so on. So that's not in protection of, or it is the software hasn't, or the open source license has not been created to protect the producer, it's to protect the consumer.
So this is an important distinction, right? 100%, and that's why this is true. So in almost no circumstances in our daily lives do we have the ability to control the products that underpin the things that control our lives, right? So If these licenses are designed to protect the user, if these systems are designed to protect the user,
It's
then as software developers and users, right, we have the responsibility to use that power to really protect our users, right? And in this case, I would say, and Corley would say, and I'll would say, that part of protecting our users is preventing these kinds of egregious harm, right? I think that that's, I mean, this gets very like, but like, we, in this case, we literally, for some definition of own the means of production, right? We actually control the things that go to, like, GitHub is based on Rails, right? I mean, so many things are based on Rails. Like, you name it, it's probably a Rails app, or was at some point, right? So like, we can all send PRs to the Rails thing. And that's often used to say, well, that's used in a negative connotation, right? But it can also be used in a like, we all can say we're not cool with this anymore, right? And we can say that in order to protect our users, not ourselves, I don't care, I mean, whatever, right? We need to take some kind of action. That sort of makes sense.
It gets weird because the people are it's a very complicated subject, so
yes,
obviously.
I'm not a lawyer, I should say.
and also the people you're protecting are no longer the users, but they're subject to the system that you're.
It gets very complex. That's why it's difficult to enforce, right?
Yes.
So we'll see. You look.
I think the best way to look at the Hippocratic license is from the same angle that you look at the GPL license, actually, meaning that the GPL license is a viral license which stretches down to the end consumer. And the MIT license is not, and the Hippocratic license is. So the Hippocratic license is a way to say, yes, you can use our software and you can use it for commercial needs, and you don't have to, for example, the choice, for example, that the GPL takes is that if you make changes to the software, you need to share those changes, and also if you are requested to provide the changed version of the software that you have changed, you are required to comply and you need to provide that software. That's a choice that the GPL license makes, knowingly. By the same token, the Hippocratic license makes a choice knowingly that the use of the software has to be considered. It's just a different choice. And like Noah said, it's not, nobody tried to enforce it yet. For example, the GPL license is in various stages of enforcement. There are lawsuits which enforce the disclosure of modified GPL software. But by the same token, at some point, it might so happen that the Hippocratic license is also going to be tested in court in the same way. But for example, imagine that you have a client or a company that does not have best practices and wants to provide services to entities which are known to violate human rights. The point of this license is to make it inconvenient or undesirable for that company to provide your software as a service to those entities. That's introducing extra constraints, which are up to the owner, author, or maker of the software, just as choosing between GPL or BSD licenses.
So I'd like to add something which is like running all the way back to the beginning, because I think you might have skipped over a small part which might not be clear to everyone. Software licenses are granted by us as software developers through the copyright laws. Software is a work of art in that sense, just like a book or a movie or a painting would be. And because we have written it, we have authored it, we are allowed to grant a copy to somebody under any terms that we might come up with.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd like to raise mostly a practical issue. Is that I'm assuming here that the Hippocratic license is not compatible with GPL and is not, for example, the free software guidelines. And this means that if you would explain devil's advocate here, that if you develop your software and give it the license, you're excluding your software from a lot of use cases, a lot of acceptable and normal use cases that don't harm anybody. So if you would like to have your software included in Ubuntu, for example, the easiest way to do that is to get it first included in Debian. And Debian has quite strict guidelines on what is considered free software and only include free software. So that means that if you want to have your software apt-get installable, this license is going to prevent that from happening easily. If you want to use libraries that already exist, and there are tons of libraries already existing that are licensed under the GPL, just like Linux kernel, just like a ton of new software. Choosing the Hippocratic license is going to prevent you from using those libraries. And correct me if I'm missing. Yeah, but there has I think it's not going to make it trivial. It's going to raise some issues.
So to that point, I think part of this is that as a kind of viral license, the idea then would be, well, someone should say, hey, why is this not included, right? Why do we not talk about that this way, right? Like, this is a very new license. Why isn't it in these lists?
Yeah, and that,
should it be?
In the case of the, if it is indeed not compatible with GPL,
well, just as MIT is not strictly compatible with GPL. For example, when I have a library which contains GPL code, it's annotated loud and clear in the readme of that library. This library includes GPL code. If you want to use it in such a way that it's not compatible with GPL, it's going to be your problem immediately. By the same token, if you run your software for terrible causes, if you run it on a Linux machine, it doesn't mean that you are incompatible with GPL codes.
It's clear that user space applications in the Linux system are not acknowledged by the GPL license.
You can also have your proprietary kernel module.
So there we still have to have some nice code cases.
I think the general point is that the friction is intentional. It's supposed to be inconvenient to raise a conversation, to start a discussion, but to make sure that we have the right discussions as tech workers on how software can or cannot be. So I think it's by design that it's not in the list yet. And that meetings like these raise the attention and try to discuss.
But I wanted to make the case that there is a ton of software already licensed under the GPL, and there's no possibility that you're gonna be able to change the license of that software. Thousands and thousands of people have contributed to that. You won't ever be able to get them to sign off. And then you get into the sort of situation that we have with ZFS at the moment, where, yeah, you can combine it, but sometimes you can't see the clouds.
So
it's greater. And even if you would get the Hippocratic license on the lists of approved software licenses, you'll still have this friction between already existing software and this new software. And even if you would get a GPL version 4, which will include an exception or even the conditions, you'll still have all the ton of software written in the last decades.
I think
that you won't be able to change.
The notion here is not that this license is going to fix all of our problems, right? The notion here is that this is going to inspire this kind of friction, these kind of conversations. I also think it's worth pointing out that another Kotlin project, right, the contributors code of conduct, made it into Linux. It took like 10 years, I think, but like nothing is impossible. You know, we control this stuff. We can make this stuff happen.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you know if there was any lawyer that confirmed that this license is actually internally consistent? Because the MIT says that you get the right to the software without restriction, and then the same license introduces restriction, right?
Yep.
So then you can make case that it's inconsistent.
Yep. So they are working with various legal people to make it happen. There's also a portion that was added in, I think, 1.2 of the license. This is something to the effect of, if it is determined that this is like self-referentially incoherent, then it will not apply. Right. So they're hedging against this.
Okay, so I want to be also a devil's advocate here. I think it's an awesome goal that we try to achieve, but it has the law of not harming others, right? That's the idea that we take as guideline for this license. That's already law. There's already a UN. So if you go to court right now and you say that they harm people, I am taking ICE here as the biggest example. We can just make a case with the UN, and it will take a lot of years, but action will be taken. And I think that there are organizations fighting this right now. And then there's a person in the government that makes an exec that ignores the ruling. But what says that if we enforce this, the same thing wouldn't happen?
Yeah.
So if GitHub backs out of ICE, they will just build it themselves, right?
Yeah, that's a terrible argument, though. Right?
No, I'm just trying to figure out, like, if we're going to enforce this, who is going to enforce it? Because I, as a software developer, have by no means the legal power to go to court with large enterprises or even with the government.
But you do. You probably have control of the repo. That guy. The chef
Seth Fargo, yeah, he just took down his repo.
His whole thing, right? I mean, that's a drastic step.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm just trying to figure out here, like, if I found out that someone is using my software to hurt others, what steps should I take? Because if I go to court, I'm gone, right? Especially against the government. I am by no means a match for them. And of course, there will be parties that will back me up, but
no, as I understand it, then you have you can deny them access to your software.
Yeah, sure.
To a limited degree. I mean, they'll have their own copies, right?
So
But then that's far simpler to accomplish than
sure. Like Seth Fargo did, but he also impacted a very large crowd of people who were not abusing license. So it was a hard choice.
So I don't know how many of you work at companies that have license restrictions. So in I have a thing in our documentation, like if you're going to import a package, make sure it doesn't have these things, right?
Yeah.
That's, eventually the hope would be that something like this would get in there, right? And so they just couldn't, right? And if enough software is using that, it will impede these missions to the point where they have to look for alternate solutions.
Right? The idea, if you will, is not introducing that license and then enforced. The idea is not having your software chosen.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's proactive.
Because if a legal person knows, we really feel like next year we really feel like opening a gigantic contract with the secret police of Saudi Arabia, then they will probably say, this library might be a problem. Let's not use it.
But that's also because if you have multiple libraries using this license, then you constantly have to find alternatives, right? And that makes the cost of that higher. Because you can use libraries, you have to write a lot of stuff on your own.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go to court, you make it more difficult to build software that will cost high.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a proactive.
It's also worth
competitive.
It's also worth pointing out that the idea behind it is that it's not about targeting people as much as it is targeting actions, right? So it is the action of how it is being used, not necessarily like, Jim is a developer for, whatever, right? The Saudi secret police, right? It's not about what they're doing because they're a developer, right? We are all developers, right? Or tech workers, whatever. It's about the action that is taken with the code in question.
Photos has a question.
Yeah, I have a question, and excuse my naive question, kind of like my naivety on the topic. I don't know much about licenses, but I'm thinking from a moral standpoint. And here's how I think about that. So I did, the tracking and targeting motive. And the moment I did that, I don't know how this is going to be used. It might be used to land something on the moon, and it might be used to land a bomb at the same time, right? So I have no moral implications at the moment to do that. Now somebody's taking that and he's building a bomb for that, right? And again, you have no idea how this is going to be used. The bomb might kill people, like knowingly causing harm, but at the same time, the same bomb might be used to kill a person who's like harming other people, like a terrorist, or I don't know, like a person who's like knowingly harming a lot of people. So here's like the gist of it. You do not know the moral implications of software until the moment you apply them. And there's going to be moral judgment. So again, maybe I'm like sidetracking the whole conversation, and probably my question is naive. But then I have a hard time understanding like how do you apply this in real world when you don't have a moral judgment at some point and you have the ethical ramifications. And you don't know them until the end. So that's
this
maybe
gets
there's a definition in the United Nations.
we can get a beer later tonight. No.
Welcome to all of moral philosophy, right? We can't predict the outcomes of our actions.
So, well, speaking of moral philosophy, so I would say that the only thing, so for me, I'm a consequentialist, right? So I think it's the consequences of our actions that matter, not the intent we have, right? So if I intend to build software to save the world, and it turns out that it gets used, for example, let's talk about Uber, right? Their stated mission is, or like, we're going to connect the world or something like that, right? Or we're going to provide transport for everybody. But what they're actually doing is creating an economic model that is unsustainable and punishes the people doing the actual work, right? We can talk about that later. It's a whole other thing, I know. But their intent is pure, right? You look at any Uber person's or any tech person's social media, right? And you're like, oh, this little widget I made, it's gonna, right? And that's good. We should feel that way, right?
Yeah, it's gonna change the world.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
The software, right, is gonna fucking change everything. But change can also be bad, right? So it's important to look at the consequences of what happens, right? And sometimes you can't know the consequence until after it's happened. So that's where you could say, well, look, my intent with the software was not to do that. It's been used this way. Now I'm going to restrict its usage, right? Because I've seen how it can be used to do harm, right? It's not about the individual open source dev. It's not about blaming somebody. It's not about looking like I have to predict every possible negative outcome because that's not possible, right? Like, if it is, like, you could be a trillionaire. It's just not possible. And so this is about giving us a lever to control if something like this happens.
All right, I think we can end it there. If you want to discuss more with Noah and Dawn, I guess. So, have a drink. There's still some pizza. We'll let you know when you need to.
Thank you, Noah. Tech workers,